In the winter of 1847, a young Hungarian physician at Vienna General Hospital discovered that he could cut the death rate of new mothers by 900% by asking the doctors to wash their hands. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. He was 28 years old and he had numbers. Not a theory, not a philosophical position, numbers. In the maternity ward, where medical students delivered babies directly after performing autopsies, 1 in 10 mothers died of fever within days of giving birth. In the ward staffed by midwives who had never touched a corpse, the rate was under 2%. Semmelweis introduced a chlorinated lime solution for hand washing. The death rate in the doctors' ward dropped to match the midwives within months. He presented his findings to the faculty of Vienna General Hospital, the most credentialed physicians in Europe, men who had spent their careers in the pursuit of medical truth. They rejected him, not because the numbers were wrong. The numbers were not wrong. They rejected him because accepting the numbers meant accepting something the numbers implied, that their hands, the hands of trained physicians, had been carrying death into the maternity ward for years, that the women who died under their care had died, in part because of them. Semmelweis spent the next 15 years trying to be heard. He wrote letters, he published papers. He grew increasingly desperate, increasingly erratic. In 1865, he was committed to a mental asylum. He died there at 47 of the very infection he had spent his life trying to prevent. 12 years later, Louis Pasteur approved the germ theory of disease. Everything Semmelweis had documented was confirmed. The hand-washing protocol was adopted across Europe. The men who had rejected him were not stupid. They were not uneducated. They were not even, most of them, dishonest in any ordinary sense of the word. They were the best trained physicians of their generation. And their training, their intelligence, their expertise, their professional investment in the framework they had built became the very mechanism of their resistance. The harder question, the one that stays with you, is this: what exactly happened inside the minds of men capable of looking at a 90% reduction in maternal mortality and deciding that the evidence was insufficient? That question has an answer. The record shows it has been answered, documented, and demonstrated across 2 centuries and across every field of human inquiry. And once you understand the mechanism, you stop feeling like you're losing your mind when you watch it happen in front of you today. In 1988, the British historian Paul Johnson published a book called Intellectuals. It was, on the surface, a series of biographical portraits: Rousseau, Marx, Shelley, Ibsen, Tolstoy, Hemingway, Bertrand Russell. But the portraits were organized around a thesis. And the thesis was this: that the secular intellectual, the man who had proclaimed his right to subvert traditional authority and reconstruct human society according to reason, had, almost without exception, refused to submit himself to any authority at all, including the authority of facts. Johnson wasn't making a political argument. He was making a diagnostic one. And the diagnosis came from the biographical record, not from ideology. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the first case, and the deepest one, because Rousseau was first in time and first in influence. He is, in many ways, the founding father of the modern intellectual as a type, the man of ideas who claims the moral authority to reorganize society and instruct the human race in how to live. He was also the man who abandoned all 5 of his children to the Paris Family Hospital within days of their birth. You need to sit with that for a moment, because it is not incidental. The children were not abandoned in a moment of poverty or desperation. Rousseau was supported by wealthy patrons throughout his life. They were abandoned as a matter of deliberate choice, repeated 5 times, and then defended in writing as the reasonable thing to have done. And then he wrote Émile. Émile, published in 1762, is one of the most celebrated treatises on education in the history of Western thought. It is a careful, passionate, sophisticated argument for how a child should be raised, with attention to natural development, with patience and love, with respect for the child's inherent dignity and freedom. It influenced educational philosophy across Europe. Rousseau wrote it having never raised a child, having specifically arranged never to raise a child. When this contradiction was raised, gently, carefully, by people who admired him, Rousseau did not revise his position. He produced justifications. The children would have been corrupted by society anyway. He lacked the means to raise them properly. It was, in some philosophically defensible sense, the compassionate choice. The justifications became more elaborate over time, not less. He never said, "I was wrong." Johnson's argument in Intellectuals is that this pattern is not a biographical accident. It is a structural feature. When you build your entire identity around the belief that your reasoning is more reliable than received tradition, more reliable than the church, more reliable than ordinary moral intuition, more reliable than the accumulated experience of the civilization you were born into, you cannot afford to be wrong about something as fundamental as how to treat a child. Being wrong there doesn't just mean you made a mistake. It means the entire enterprise, the whole project of the secular intellectual as moral authority, is compromised at its foundation. So you don't admit you were wrong. You explain why you weren't. The intelligence that was supposed to be the tool of truth becomes the mechanism of its own protection. Karl Marx is the second major case, and the mechanism becomes even clearer, because with Marx you have something Rousseau didn't produce in the same way: predictions. Economic predictions, specific and falsifiable, about what industrial capitalism would do and when. The predictions failed. Not after Marx's death, where he could not have known within his lifetime. The industrial working class in England, which, according to Marx's analysis, should have been approaching revolutionary consciousness by the 1860s, was instead joining trade unions, negotiating wages, and demonstrating a stubborn preference for incremental material improvement over historical transformation. This was observable. Marx could observe it. Friedrich Engels, his closest collaborator, his financial patron, his most loyal reader, privately noted the gap between the theory and the evidence. Their letters document it. Marx's response was not to revise the first premises. The response was theoretical elaboration. If the working class was not yet revolutionary, then there must be a mechanism by which it had been prevented from understanding its own interests. False consciousness, superstructure, ideological manipulation. The theory expanded to absorb the counter-evidence. Each expansion required more intellectual work, more sophistication, more explanatory machinery. By the end of his life, the theoretical apparatus was extraordinarily complex, and the original question, does the evidence support the core prediction, had been buried inside the apparatus where it couldn't be easily examined. This is not stupid. This is, in a perverse way, what a powerful mind does. A weak mind simply ignores contradictory evidence. A powerful mind explains it away, incorporates it, transforms it from a challenge into a confirmation. The greater the intelligence, the more effective the conversion. The record shows this pattern repeating across Johnson's gallery, not because these men shared a political ideology, but because they shared a structural condition. They had all, at some point, staked their identity on a framework. And identity cannot revise itself the way an argument can. Paul Johnson puts it plainly in Intellectuals. The secular intellectual, having proclaimed his right to subvert traditional authority, refused to submit himself to any authority at all, especially the authority of facts. That sentence is not a political accusation. It is a documented description of a mode of failure that recurs wherever a mind strong enough to build a system becomes too invested in the system to question it. Now, here is where the mechanism spreads beyond the individual. On May 29, 1919, observations taken during a solar eclipse confirmed Einstein's general theory of relativity. The papers that carried the news the next morning did not lead with the physics. They led with the philosophy, or what the popular imagination decided was the philosophy. If space and time were relative, then surely everything else was too. Truth, morality, good and evil. The very categories by which human beings had organized their lives. Einstein was reportedly appalled. The physics said nothing of the kind. Relativity was a precise mathematical description of how space and time behave under conditions of extreme gravity and velocity. It had no implications for moral philosophy. The word relative in the equations does not mean what it means in the sentence, morality is relative. This is not a subtle distinction. It is a basic one, but the headline was more useful than the physics, and the headline spread. Johnson's argument in modern times is that this misread was not entirely innocent. The intellectuals who popularized it, who took the language of Einsteinian physics and applied it to ethics, to political theory, to the whole project of reconstructing society, knew, or should have known, what they were doing. They had a framework they preferred. The misread of Einstein gave that framework scientific authority it had not earned, and the authority once claimed was very difficult to give back. This is the mechanism spreading from individual minds to the culture itself. A misread becomes a consensus. A consensus becomes the air that the next generation breathes. And by the time someone points out that the original equation said no such thing, the conclusion has already been built into the structure of how educated people talk and think. The viewer watching educated, credentialed people in 2026 defend positions the evidence no longer supports is not watching something new. The record shows it has a beginning, it has a mechanism, and once you can name the mechanism, you can stop asking whether these people are stupid and start asking a more precise question. That question is what this video has been building toward. But before we get there, I want to name something else it's building toward as well. If you've been watching this pattern repeat, if you've been in conversations where you can see what's happening but you don't quite have the language to name it precisely enough to be useful, there's a reference guide in the description called the Civilizational Vocabulary. It's 40 terms from Johnson's framework, each defined with a historical example and applied to the current moment. Not a reading list. A translation tool, the kind of thing you open before a hard conversation, not after one. The link is in the description. Now, the precise question. In 1945, Raymond Aron was one of the most respected political philosophers in France. He and Jean-Paul Sartre had been close since their student days at the École Normale Supérieure, two of the most formidable analytical minds of their generation, formed by the same education, shaped by the same intellectual culture. By the early 1950s, the reports from the Soviet Union had become impossible to ignore. The labor camps were documented, the show trials were documented. The scale of the purges under Stalin was, for anyone willing to look at the evidence, available in the record. Aron had looked. In 1955, he published The Opium of the Intellectuals, a careful, precise, historically documented account of how the Western intellectual class had managed to explain away the Soviet reality in service of an ideological commitment it was not willing to surrender. Sartre's case is the one that matters most here. Because Sartre was not deceived, he was not operating with incomplete information. He was one of the most analytically precise minds in Europe, and he had access to the same evidence Aron had. What is documented in the exchange between them, in Sartre's own essays from this period, in the biographical accounts of people who knew both men, is this. Sartre acknowledged, in private, that the evidence was real. He knew what the gulags were. He understood what the show trials meant. And he explained, also in private, why he couldn't say so publicly. To acknowledge the Soviet reality openly, he argued, would demoralize the French left. The working class needed a horizon. Taking away the horizon, even a false one, would do more damage than maintaining the useful fiction. The truth was real. The truth was also, in his judgment, inconvenient for the outcome he preferred. So he didn't tell it. This is the climax of the pattern. This is what Semmelweis's persecutors could not have told you, because they had perhaps genuinely convinced themselves that his data was flawed. This is what Rousseau could not quite tell you, because his self-justifications had by then become real to him. But Sartre tells you, the mechanism in its full and honest form is not, I am too invested in my framework to see the evidence clearly. The mechanism in its full and honest form is, I can see the evidence clearly, and I have decided that the evidence matters less than the outcome I prefer. The intelligence is not the victim of the self-deception. The intelligence is its instrument. The greater the mind, the more effectively it can manage the gap between what the evidence shows and what the preferred conclusion requires. The sophisticated thinker does not simply ignore the contradictory fact. He explains why the contradictory fact, while technically accurate, is not the relevant one right now. Sartre was not stupid. Sartre was, by any reasonable measure, one of the finest analytical minds of the 20th century, and he chose ideology over the record. Deliberately, knowingly, with full command of his own reasoning. This is the answer to the question the Semmelweis case opened at the beginning of this video. What exactly happens inside a mind capable of looking at a 90% reduction in maternal mortality and deciding the evidence is insufficient? Sometimes it is genuine blindness, the self-sealing quality of a framework that has become an identity. But sometimes, the record shows, it is something more deliberate than that. Sometimes the mind sees the evidence perfectly well, and the question it is actually answering is not, is this true? The question it is actually answering is this useful to admit? That is not stupidity. It is a different kind of failure. And it is in many ways a harder one to recover from, because it is not a failure of vision. It is a failure of honesty. Which brings us, finally, to the part of this that applies not only to the people you are watching, but to anyone who has ever built their life around a set of convictions. Paul Johnson's account of the American founding and a history of the American people returns again and again to something he finds remarkable about the founders: their institutionalized distrust of their own intelligence. These were not men who lacked confidence. Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, Adams. By any measure, this was an extraordinary concentration of intellectual capability in a single political project. They knew it, and they built into the system, deliberately, a set of mechanisms that assumed even they could be wrong. The amendment process, the separation of powers, the checks that prevented any single institution, including the one they were creating, from becoming self-certifying. Johnson's argument is that this was not humility as performance, it was humility as engineering. They had read enough history to know what happened to systems built on the assumption that the men running them were wise enough not to need correction. Those systems all ended the same way. The self-correction mechanism is not a concession to weakness. It is the evidence of a particular kind of strength, the strength that comes from having genuinely reckoned with the record rather than having decided in advance what the record is supposed to show. And this is where the pattern we've traced across 2 centuries of intellectual failure points, finally, towards something useful. The viewer who came to this video frustrated by watching credentialed people defend the indefensible is right to be frustrated. The pattern is real. The mechanism is documented. The historical record does not flatter the intellectual class when examined with Johnson's rigor. But Johnson's rigor does not spare anyone, including, if we are being honest about this, the viewer. The same intelligence that built the frameworks we believe in can be deployed to protect those frameworks from examination. The same capacity for pattern recognition that allows a careful reader of history to see what the credentialed class is doing can be turned, without our noticing, toward protecting our own preferred conclusions from the same scrutiny we apply to theirs. The founders built external correction into the system because they knew internal correction was unreliable. They didn't trust their own minds to catch their own errors. They were probably the most justified group of people in American history to trust their own minds. And they didn't. That is not a counsel of despair, it is a design principle. And it is available to anyone willing to apply it. Semmelweis died in 1865, believing he had failed. The evidence he had gathered over 15 years of careful observation was confirmed within a decade of his death. The women who died in those years, the ones who didn't have to, are the permanent cost of the mechanism he was fighting. The mechanism that killed them was not ignorance. It was something closer to what Johnson diagnosed in Intellectuals: the refusal of a mind committed to a framework to submit that framework to the authority of facts. The refusal, finally, to ask the hardest question available to any honest thinker. Not, am I right? But, what would it take to convince me that I was wrong? If you cannot answer that question about your own most important convictions, if you cannot name the evidence that would cause you to revise them, then the record suggests you are no longer investigating. You are defending, and the intelligence you're using to do it is working against the purpose it was built for. The record shows that the most dangerous intellectual failure is not the failure of a weak mind to think clearly. It is the failure of a strong mind to remain honest. The question that remains, the one this kind of history always leaves behind, is a quiet one. It is not about Sartre or Rousseau or the physicians of Vienna. It is about the framework you have carried longest, the conviction you defend most instinctively, the idea about which you have never quite been able to articulate what the contradicting evidence would look like. That is the one worth examining, not because it is probably wrong, but because the refusal to examine it is the beginning of the mechanism we've been tracing all along. Tell me this, which figure from history do you think understood this danger most clearly and paid the highest price for it? The name and why. I read every comment.